Hello there, friend. Thank you for joining Fairfax Files. Before we get into the case today, I want to thank you for clicking on this video. I know that YouTube suggested a lot of videos, but you clicked on this one, and it really means a lot to me that you're supporting this channel.
Fairfax Files, where the stories ignite. In the darkness will shine the light. Paranormal whispers, the unexplained. Justice Unchained, Justice Unchained.
Today we're going to talk about one of the most gripping cases ever. Wrongful conviction of 5 young men. You might have seen the Netflix series about it. And if you haven't, I urge you to watch it after you listen to this video. On the night of April 19, 1989, there was a 28-year-old investment banker, and she went for her usual evening jog through Central Park in New York City. What happened next would become one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. And not because of the crime itself, but because of a catastrophic failure of justice that would destroy the lives of 5 innocent teenagers. Their names were Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Korey Wise. They were just kids, 14 to 16 years old. And they were arrested, coerced into false confessions, and convicted of a brutal assault they didn't even commit. They would spend between 6 and 13 years in prison before the truth finally emerged. That's very hard to imagine, but it did happen. This is the story of how a rush to judgment, racial bias, and interrogation tactics targeting minors, nonetheless, created one of the most notorious wrongful convictions in modern American history. This is the story of the Central Park 5. To understand how this injustice occurred, we need to take it back to New York in the city in 1989. Now, at the time, the city was in the grip of a crack epidemic. Violent crime rates were soaring through the roof, and fear dominated headlines every single day. Central Park had become a symbol of urban decay, a place where many New Yorkers feared to go after dark. On that April evening, several groups of teenagers had gathered in Central Park. Some were from Harlem, others from different neighborhoods. They were doing what teenagers do, hanging out. Some engaging in minor mischief like throwing rocks and bothering cyclists. This activity, which police would later characterize as wilding, was not uncommon in the park. It's not uncommon in most behavior with kids, especially young teenagers. Among these teenagers were our 5 protagonists. Again, Antron McCray, he was 15 at the time, a good student who loved baseball. Kevin Richardson, 14, a talented musician who played trumpet in his school band. Yusef Salaam, 15, an aspiring writer who loved poetry. Raymond Santana, 14, a quiet kid who stayed close to home. And last but not least, Korey Wise, 16, who had learning difficulties but a gentle nature and was only in the park because he wanted to accompany his friend Yusef. None of them knew each other well. They weren't a gang or a close-knit group even. They were just teenagers who happened to be in the same place at the same time. At approximately 9 p.m. that night, Trisha Miley, a 28-year-old investment banker at Salomon Brothers, left her apartment on the Upper East Side for her regular evening run. She entered Central Park, like she always did, at 84th Street and headed north toward the reservoir. What happened next remains largely unknown, as Miley has no memory of the attack due to severe head trauma. What we know is that sometime around 9:30 p.m., she was brutally assaulted while jogging on the east near 102 2nd Street. She was beaten with a rock or a pipe, sexually assaulted, and left for dead in a ravine about 300 feet from the road. Miley lost 70% of her blood and her body temperature dropped to 84 degrees. When she was discovered around 1:30 a.m. by two men walking in the park, doctors didn't expect her to survive. She would spend 12 days in a coma and weeks recovering from skull fractures, severe brain damage, and other injuries. She was left for dead. The brutality of the crime shocked New York City. The media, like always, immediately dubbed the victim with their type of media name and called her the Central Park Jogger. And the case became front page news across the country. Within hours of the discovery of Miley's body, police had a theory. Already, the teenagers who'd been wilding in the park that night must be responsible. By morning, they had rounded up several suspects, including our 5 teenagers. The interrogations began immediately, and this is where the case took its most disturbing turn. These were kids, guys. They were kids. Some as young as 14. Some of you listening to this story right now have kids that age. And it would be so hard to even imagine your own children being questioned without lawyers and, in most cases, without their parents present. The interrogations lasted for hours, sometimes stretching into the next day. Yeah, that must have been tough on those boys. Detective Linda Fairstein, head of the Manhattan District Attorney's Sex Crimes Unit, and other investigators, they used aggressive tactics. And these tactics were designed to break down adult crimes on these children. They lied about evidence to the kids, claimed they had witnesses, and told the teenagers their friends had already confessed and implicated them. Antron McCray was told that his fingerprints were on the victim's clothing, a complete fabrication, 100% lie. Raymond Santana was told that his DNA matched evidence from the scene, another lie. The investigators played the boys against each other, claiming that cooperating would help them go home, asking them to lie and then they will be released. What's crucial to understand is that false confessions, particularly from juveniles, are more common than most people realize. Children's brains aren't fully developed. You know that. They're young, they're impressionable, especially the parts responsible for decision making and understanding long-term consequences. Even adults admit to being guilty when they're not. When faced with adult authority, figures using manipulative tactics, many children will say whatever they think will end the immediate stress. One by one, 4 of the 5 teenagers gave statements that police claimed were confessions. Only Korey Wise, who was 16 and therefore could be tried as an adult, maintained his innocence throughout. Though he did place himself at the scene and implicated the others. But here's the critical detail that should have been raised and should have actually raised red flags immediately. The confessions didn't match each other. They didn't match the physical evidence of the crime scene, and they didn't accurately describe the crime scene or the victim's injuries. Antron McCray's statement described the victim as having blonde hair when she was actually brunette. The confessions placed the attack in different locations within the park. Some described weapons that were never found, while others omitted weapons that forensic evidence suggested were used. Most tellingly, none of the boys could accurately describe what Trisha Miley was wearing that night, despite allegedly attacking her and removing her clothing. They couldn't say what color she was wearing. They couldn't say if she was wearing shorts or pants, a jacket, a t-shirt, nothing. These weren't minor inconsistencies, guys. They were fundamental contradictions that revealed the statements as unreliable. But in the rush to solve this high-profile case, these red flags were ignored. Could you imagine? The confessions were exactly what investigators wanted to hear, confirming their theory and allowing them to close the case very quickly. And Detective Fairstein? She would later claim that the inconsistencies were due to the pack mentality of the attack, suggesting that each boy only saw part of what happened. But experts in false confessions recognize these contradictions as classic signs that the statements were coerced and unreliable. Before the teenagers had even been formally charged, the media had already convicted them in the court of public opinion. These young boys. New York's tabloid newspapers ran sensational headlines like "Wolf Pack Prey" and "Wilding to Kill." The case became a symbol of urban decay and racial tension. The contrast was stark and deliberate. A young, white, successful investment banker attacked by a group of Black and Latino teenagers from Harlem. The media narrative wrote itself, and it didn't require nuance or a careful examination of the evidence. Donald Trump then a prominent real estate developer, took out full-page ads in 4 New York newspapers calling for the return of the death penalty. It said, "Bring back the death penalty. Bring back our police." The ads declared explicitly referencing the Central Park case. The teenagers were portrayed as super predators, a term popularized in the 1990s to describe supposedly young criminals. This narrative made it very easy for the public to accept that these children were capable of such brutality, despite having no previous history of serious violence. The presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of the American justice system, was abandoned before the trial even began. The defense attorneys would face the impossible task of defending clients who had already been convicted in the media. And so the trials began in 1990, with the defendants split into 2 groups. Antron McCray, Raymond Santana, and Yusef Salaam were tried together, while Kevin Richardson and Korey Wise were tried separately. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on the confessions, the false confessions. The physical evidence was surprisingly weak for such a brutal crime. None of the defendants' DNA was found on the victim or her clothing. None of their fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and the few hairs recovered didn't match any of the defendants. This lack of physical evidence, it really should have been devastating to the prosecution's case. In a crime involving multiple attackers and significant physical violence, you would expect to find extensive forensic evidence that would be linking the perpetrators to the victim. But nothing. The defense attorneys pointed out all of the inconsistencies in the confessions and also in the evidence, or lack thereof, and argued that these young men were coerced. They brought in experts on false confessions to explain how innocent people, particularly children, could be manipulated into admitting to crimes they didn't commit. But the prosecution had a powerful weapon: videotaped portions of the confessions. The jurors saw this as the teens being guilty, and they saw the teenager defendants say they admitted this crime in their own words. Not one, but most. Describing their involvement in the attack really took a toll on the jury. You see, what the jurors didn't see were the hours of interrogation that preceded these statements. The lies, the manipulation, the psychological pressure applied to these children. They didn't see all that. They were just shown the confessions. The prosecution also argued that the lack of physical evidence was explained by the delay in arresting the suspects, and that the fact that they had cleaned up afterward. This explanation was accepted, despite its convenience and lack of supporting evidence. In August and December of 1990, all 5 defendants were convicted. Antron McCray, Raymond Santana, and Yusef Salaam were found guilty of rape, assault, and other charges. Kevin Richardson was convicted of attempted murder, rape, and assault. Korey Wise, tried as an adult, received the harshest sentence. The sentences ranged from 5 to 15 years, with Korey Wise receiving 5 to 15 years for each of several crimes. As the youngest defendants reached their maximum sentences and were released, Korey remained in prison, serving the longest sentence of any of the 5. The convictions were celebrated by prosecutors and much of the public. Justice appeared to have been served for this horrific crime. The teenagers, now young men, disappeared into the prison system, their lives seemingly destroyed by their own admissions of guilt. But even as they served their sentences, questions lingered. Advocates, journalists, and some legal experts continued to point out the problems with the case, the lack of physical evidence, the inconsistent confessions, the problematic interrogation techniques that were used on minors. These voices were largely ignored. The case was closed, the convictions were secure, and New York could now move on from this dark chapter. In 2002, 13 years after the attack, a letter arrived at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office that would change everything. It was from Matias Reyes, a convicted serial rapist and murderer serving a life sentence. Reyes confessed to the Central Park attack, providing details that had never been made public. Unlike the teenagers' confessions, Reyes' account was consistent with the physical evidence and the crime scene. He knew details about the victim's injuries, her clothing, and the location of the attack that only the real perpetrator could have known. More importantly, Reyes' DNA matched evidence from the crime scene that had never been linked to any of the 5 defendants. This wasn't circumstantial. This was not questionable evidence or a questionable confession. This was definitely scientific proof that Reyes was at the scene that night and he was the one who had sexually assaulted Trisha Miley. Reyes had acted alone. There was no gang rape, no pack of wilding teenagers. The entire theory that had led to the arrest and convictions of the Central Park 5 was completely wrong. The investigation that followed revealed even more disturbing details. Reyes had committed several other rapes in Central Park around the same time, following a similar pattern. He was a serial predator, and he specifically targeted women jogging alone in the park. Perhaps most shocking of all was the revelation that Reyes had been a suspect early in the investigation, but had been cleared when investigators became fixated on the teenagers. If they had pursued this lead instead of rushing to judgment, the real perpetrator might have been caught in 1989. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, now led by Robert Morgenthau, launched a reinvestigation of the case. And what they found was a catalog of investigative failures and prosecutorial misconduct. The original investigation had ignored physical evidence that contradicted their theory. The victim's injuries were more consistent with an attack by a single perpetrator using a weapon, not a group assault. The location where evidence was found didn't match the crime scene described in the confessions. Most damaging of all was the revelation about how the confessions were obtained. The reinvestigation found that police had used textbook coercive interrogation techniques on children, including prolonged questioning, false claims about evidence, and promises that cooperation would lead to leniency. The teenagers had been told they could go home if they just admitted to being present at the attack. They were lied to about evidence that didn't exist. They were questioned for hours without breaks, food, or adequate rest. In some cases, parents were excluded from interrogations or misled about their children's legal situation. The techniques were used to sabotage these young men, and the techniques used were designed to break down resistance and produce confessions, regardless of whether those confessions were truthful. On December 19, 2002, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office filed a motion to vacate all convictions related to the Central Park jogger case. The motion stated that the office now had grave doubts about the reliability of the confessions and that DNA evidence strongly suggests that the attack was committed by Matthias Reyes acting alone. The Central Park Five were officially exonerated, their convictions overturned, and their records cleared. After more than a decade, their innocence was finally recognized by the system that had wrongfully convicted them. But exoneration couldn't give them back the years they had lost. Antron McCray, Raymond Santana, and Yusef Salaam had served their full sentences and been released. Kevin Richardson had served 7 years. Korey Wise had suffered the most, spending 13 years in adult prisons for a crime he didn't commit. The psychological trauma was immense. These men had been branded as monsters, served time for a horrific crime, and faced a lifetime of stigma. Even after their exoneration, some people continued to believe they were guilty, unable to accept that such a massive failure of justice was possible. In 2003, the 5 men filed a civil lawsuit against New York City, by right, and understandably so, claiming that the police and prosecutors had violated their rights. The lawsuit would drag on for more than a decade before finally being settled in 2014 for $41 million, approximately $1 million for each year of imprisonment. The Central Park Five case stands as one of the most significant wrongful convictions in American history, not just for the injustice it represents, but for the lessons it teaches about the criminal justice system. It demonstrates the danger of false confessions, particularly from juveniles. Studies have shown that teenagers are far more likely to confess to crimes they didn't commit when they are subjected to aggressive interrogation techniques. Yet, many jurisdictions still lack adequate protections for minors during police questioning. The case also highlights the role of racial bias in the criminal justice system. The rush to judgment, the media coverage, and the public's willingness to believe the worst about these teenagers. And this cannot be separated from the fact that they were young Black and Latino men accused of attacking a white woman. Perhaps most importantly, the case shows how tunnel vision can corrupt an investigation. Once investigators decided that these teenagers were guilty, they ignored evidence that contradicted their theory and used coercive techniques to produce confessions that supported them, even though it didn't make sense. The Central Park Five have become advocates for criminal justice reform, and they're working to prevent other wrongful convictions. Their story has been told in documentaries, books, and the Netflix series called When They See Us, ensuring that the experience continues to educate and inspire change. Today, Korey Wise operates a clothing line and advocates for the wrongfully convicted. Yusef Salaam is involved in criminal justice reform and ran for political office. The others have worked to rebuild their lives while carrying the weight of their experience. Their story reminds us that the presumption of innocence isn't just a legal principle. It's a moral imperative. And it shows us that even when the system fails catastrophically, truth and justice can ultimately prevail through the cost of that failure. Though the cost of that failure can never be fully repaid. The Central Park Five case changed how we think about wrongful convictions, false confessions, and the treatment of juveniles in the criminal justice system. But most importantly, it reminds us that behind every case are real people whose lives hang in the balance of our pursuit of justice. This is a very sad case. And even though they received $1 million for each year that they were imprisoned, can it really pay for what they went through? Korey Wise especially being in jail 13 years. And good on him for creating a business. God only knows what he saw and what he went through behind those bars with all of those adults being such a young man. All of them went through a hard, tough time. Thank you so much for joining Fairfax Files. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you staying till the end. Please take a moment to subscribe. Hit the like button to let me know that you're here and you enjoy my content. If you have any suggestions on a case, I would appreciate it if you put it down below in the comments. This story particularly stole my heart. It really made me feel like if the children out there don't have protection, then really, who are we as a society? Thank you. Be good to yourself out there. Be good to others. And until I see you next week, please be safe.
Shadow falls where truth won't speak. Innocence stolen week by week. Unsolved